ensuring business continuity, among other things. It is therefore fitting that the CIP has organized this webinar to address the issue of severe weather planning and trade lane management in the Caribbean. We're very pleased to be joined by MAERSK, a very recent partner of the CIP, for taking the time to be with us today for today's proceedings. We're pleased to be joined by Mr. Robin Towley, Head of Special Projects and Logistics of MAERSK, Mr. Todd Pigeon, Chief Commercial Officer from SEAL and MR, Brian Harold, Managing Director of APM Terminals in Mobile, Alabama. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time. Thank you for your partnership with the OAS on this critical issue of ports, one of the very important issues that we address within the context of development. These speakers will address important aspects of port resiliency and operations during difficult times. They will speak to the complexity of port management and severe weather impacts on port infrastructure. They will share their expertise for planning through storms and how to weather the storm, looking at the issues of business continuity under blue and gray skies. We hope that going forward, we can continue to collaborate with MAERSK and like entities in the planning for disasters and generally in terms of strengthening port competitiveness in the region. Following the passage of Hurricane Maria, which devastated my country, Dominica, I requested that the CIP develop a project in the region to focus on improving disaster risk management for ports in the Caribbean. I'm very pleased to inform that the CIP will begin implementing this project in short order. The project will focus on strengthening the institutional capacity of port and maritime authorities in the Caribbean to help mitigate the impact of natural and man-made disasters on port operations and look at the issue of business continuity. The project comprises 4 phases or 4 stages. Stage 1 is on risk assessment and capabilities, including the review of existing emergency response plans in the Caribbean ports. Stage 2, a model emergency operations plan for Caribbean ports is to be drafted to effectively prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Stage 3 will consist of training, which can be adjusted to local needs and requirements. And stage 4 will look at drills and hands-on exercises. I would like to, in advance, thank the MAERSK team for the important role that they will play in this project. And let me take this opportunity to commend the CIP team under the leadership of Jorge Duran and ably assisted by Mona Snoboda. Thank you so much, Jorge, for always responding to my calls, sometimes my impossible calls, for work that you always take on board and you always find ways to deliver. And I think that is the important work of the CIP, finding ways, establishing partnerships to deliver to our member states. I'm very grateful to be leading a team of able-bodied individuals, those who are willing always to go the extra mile. And I know that I can rely on Jorge and his team to do so. So with that, I welcome you to this webinar. I look forward to the discussion and look forward to our work together in the Caribbean as we confront this issue of natural disasters. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you very much for not only for your remarks, opening remarks, but for, of course, speaking well of us and the team. Thank you in the name of Mona and Paola and Sabina and Monse and all the young professionals that I've had the pleasure to work with. Before we go into the meat and the substance of the seminar, and I'll give the floor to Robin, I would like just to tell the participants again, thank you for being here. We have been joining little by little by more and more participants, and I expect to have a couple more by the next few minutes. the way that we're going to do this, ladies and gentlemen, is that any questions that you might have, please write them on the chat function of the WebEx, and Mona and I will make sure to take note of them, and then we will present them to the panelists at the end of their presentation. There's really at the end, this is how we're going to do it. And again, I thank you very much. And without further ado, let me introduce Robin Townley. Robin has been a friend of the CIP for almost the last year, I'm going to say. And we would have already been doing several things together, if not for the pandemic. Rob, my friend, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'll let you introduce your team, Brian and Todd, yourself. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jorge, and thank you everyone on the line for tuning in. I think it's fantastic to know that we've got some familiar faces to me on the call as well. Curtis, you and I chatted briefly yesterday, and you and I haven't seen each other since the Dorian response in Bahamas. So great to see you on the line, as well as everybody else that's joined us today. In terms of it's a very brief introduction, my name is Rob Townley. I'm the head of special projects at MAERSK, and our responsibility within the larger kind of constellation and organization of MAERSK is primarily on emergency relief, disaster response, and some of the more high risk or high complexity work that MAERSK takes on as a global transport organization. And I'm joined today by Todd Pigeon, the Chief Commercial Officer of Sealand, which is one of our major liner brands that covers Latin America and the Caribbean, and Brian Harold, the head of terminal operations, and actually the head of the terminal at our large facility in Mobile, Alabama. I think having the three of us on one call in conjunction with all of you on the line with us right now is going to give a really rich discussion that will look at severe weather planning and emergency operations from a very, I guess, a very diverse points of view. So we don't just look at the port as a standalone, but we look at the port and the Port Authority as part of a larger ecosystem that supports global trade and supports the communities and countries that within which it exists. So with that, I'm going to share some slides and just give you 1 second to get that going. And please let me know if you guys can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm going to skip over the title slide here. It's just what we're going to be covering today.
If I may briefly interrupt you.
Please, go ahead, Jorge.
Without the video. I was going to recommend to our audience, please click on the upper right-hand corner on the button so as to blow up the presentation on the screen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. So we'll skip over the title slide here. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We've got a lot of folks on the line, and I'm happy everyone's here. So the agenda, I think we've gone over the basics of the speaker introductions, but I would like to turn the mic over very briefly to my colleagues, Todd and Brian, just to introduce themselves, because they know their business far better than I ever could, and they know their relationship to this narrative and this discussion far better than I could as well. So I just to turn it over briefly to Brian and then to Todd. Brian, would you mind introducing yourself and what you do and what you're responsible for within APMT?
Sure. Thank you, Robin. I appreciate it. And let me just make sure that I'm not on mute here, which doesn't look like I am. Okay, good. So I appreciate it. So I am Managing Director of APM Terminals in the Port of Mobile, Alabama. My responsibilities are for really anything and everything that impacts our business in Mobile and in Alabama, for that matter. So everything from cargo flows, commercial recruitment of new business, to project management and bring on new equipment, expansion of the facility, stakeholder management, and so really it's full P&L responsibility. I was new to the Gulf Coast and really having to manage anything with hurricane preparedness about 10 years ago when I came to Mobile. So I'd come here from the Port of New York, New Jersey, which interestingly enough, when I left to come to Mobile, my predecessor here said, you got to be really watch out for those hurricanes. As he was going to New Jersey to go where I was coming from, and then he was promptly hit by Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey. So that was a pretty big wake up call for me. But I feel like I've learned a lot in the 10 years that I've been here. just really from an outsider's perspective. So I'm happy to share some of that knowledge with you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. And Todd as well?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Let me get my audio. Okay, so yeah, Chief Commercial Officer of Sealand. Sealand is a brand focusing on the Americas within the MAERSK group. I'm based in South Florida, but we cover almost every island within the Caribbean, as well as South America, Central America, and North America. We're owners as well as charterers of vessels. We own the containers and operate the vessels that go into many of your Caribbean ports and looking to grow to others. And so I represent about 300 professionals in the maritime industry that are focused on containerized trade within the Americas. So I'm happy to be here and speak to you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Todd. And for those of you on the phone who may not be able to join by video, I'll just see if I can read some of the points on the screen as well. I'd like to highlight a quote that I've got up on the screen now. It's from a favorite of mine from President Eisenhower, which is all about planning. And it says, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And the key to a good decision in crisis is that the responsible officer has been living with the issue long before it becomes acute." I think that's one of the objectives that we're trying to get to here today, is to really introduce all of us to all the rest of us to make sure that we do have these relationships in advance and we can work to plan together as a combined public-private team under what we call blue skies versus gray skies. It's much easier to make these types of relationships and get comfortable with one another when there isn't a 100-mile wind blowing through your capital versus when we actually have to make friends in crisis, which can lead to a lot of difficulties and a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding. But the longer term we have to plan together and the more we know each other, the smoother things will go. And I think that speaks volumes to the fact that IACP CIP is putting this together and has the plans to put a long-term program in place. So to go over the agenda, and we're going to run through a few different types of major topics, and there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. So I would encourage you, please, to ask questions as we go along. If it's appropriate to stop and answer the question we see in the chat as we go, definitely I can do that. Otherwise, we'll address Q&A at the end of the presentation. And we're going to go through terminal preparedness from destinations to gateways, and kind of what we mean by that is many of the island nations and Caribbean nations that are on the phone today, that really what we focus on or what the world sees you as is destinations, places to go that are beautiful, major tourism hubs, and that's what you're used to. And it's been difficult in the past in terms of experiences that my team has had in working in the Caribbean, where after a disaster, those destinations really have to turn into major gateways for aid, for emergency relief, for reconstruction cargo. And that can be tough just from a relationship perspective, but also from a physical and regulatory perspective, unless there's good planning put in place in advance. We'll also go over the liner services perspective from Todd's point of view on how trade lane management takes place around and in preparation for things like hurricane season, what we think about when it comes to cargo priority, relationship priorities for our clients for long-term versus short-term. We'll get into some post-disaster economics, where we'll speak about kind of what happens after on day one after the storm and what you need to be prepared for and what we've seen in the past from lessons learned. And we'll also kind of relate that a little bit to what's going on with COVID. So there are a lot of parallels between small, localized, or regional disasters and what we're seeing play out now on the global scale. And we'll also talk about some good habits and overall general, I think, good practices for blue skies versus gray skies planning, and move into Q&A. Jorge, any questions on that before we move on?
No, sir. I've just reminded the audience that questions will be forthcoming, I'm sure, here in the chat. So go ahead. We'll fix it up so that you get questions at the end. I'd like to thank all the attendees. Let me put myself on screen here quickly. Oh, but you can't see me. That's fine. As you know, we have Antigua and Barbuda, the National Port Authority of Jamaica, as well, with Keisha and of Suriname, of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, of Trinidad and Tobago. We have Curtis Dennis from SEDIMA, the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency, and we expect Glenn Roach from PMAC, which is the Port Management Association of the Caribbean, to join. John is online. saying he just joined in as well. So thus far, no questions. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to the presentation. Everybody write their question on the chat, and we'll take care of it at the end. Thank you, Rob.
Great, thanks, Jorge. We'll move on to the second slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over and put in the spotlight here, since he's the man from the terminal operations side of our group, and just some commentary on the bullets and some general perspective on what his terminal does and what terminals generally are working on in the MAERSK network in terms of crisis preparedness and severe weather planning. Ryan, over to you, sir.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. So I think it goes without saying to everybody on the call that container terminals that are a huge risk for hurricane damage, and the impacts of the things that happen to those container terminals can be very far-reaching, from, of course, the impact to the local economy or the regional economy, but also to things like, you know, what can actually be picked up and relocated from the container terminal out into the general public. And if we're not being responsible about our preparations for major storms, then we're putting a lot of people in harm's way. The first thing that I would say about this from a container terminal standpoint is that, of course, you have to have a hurricane plan, and that hurricane plan really needs to be an in-depth plan that allows you to have visibility to everything that you're doing from well before the time that the storm hits until well after the storm hits. And the most important thing about that plan is that it is reviewed very often, at least once a year. But the best way, in my opinion, is to review it after every single storm. So our plan, our hurricane plan, it actually includes the reviews that we do in it. So that is part of our plan. Every March, at the beginning of March, we open up our plan and we review it as a team. And then we will have it reviewed in more detailed approaches with smaller teams into April and May, in time for hurricane season, to start. And following any type of a major storm, we will then go back and we will review things that we've learned. Because a hurricane plan has to fit your terminal, and your terminals are always changing, whether it's from the amount of volume that you handle in a given year, or to the dwell times and how they change, your average dwell times, how many containers you have on the facility at any given time, the equipment that you use, the amount of storage space that you have, and things like that. So it's so important to review that on a regular basis. And so just to give you an idea, our terminal plan in Mobile, for just our checklist that we put together for all the actions that we need to take prior to a storm hitting landfall, has 134 items on it. And just for reference, our terminal handles about 250,000 containers a year. And we have a facility of 135 acres, 4 ship-to-shore cranes, and then we're using reach stackers and top loaders and things like that at our facility. We also operate a rail facility, which is adjacent to our container terminal, which is also at risk for storms. The other thing that is important is that that within your stakeholders, I would imagine that everybody has some type of a government entity that you're working with when a storm is first identified that it might be a risk, and a process in place for how that gets escalated as a storm approaches. So for the U.S. and on the Gulf, we are working with a number of entities, but the main one is the U.S. Coast Guard. So the U.S. Coast Guard has alert levels that they go through, which there are 5 leading up to 5 different levels leading up to the time that a storm makes landfall. The first is really just when a named storm or a storm that is expected to become a named storm is approaching the Gulf of Mexico. The next phase would take place when it is 72 hours approximately from landfall, which at that point, of course, we're still a little bit unsure of where it's going to hit at landfall. The next phase would be within 48 hours of landfall. And within that point, the Coast Guard starts to limit vessel activity and things like that within the port. Then there's a 24-hour notification, which would then essentially eliminate all vessel traffic in and out of the port. And then the final one is 12 hours before landfall, and that is full and total port closure prior to the storm coming in. So we really base our hurricane plan as a terminal around those levels of preparation. Every item on our checklist is aligned with one of these alert levels that the Coast Guard would put us into. And just maybe some examples of some of the items that we have on there, things about communicating with our customers. The it depends on what type of an operation you have. Of course, we talked about leading up to this call that transshipment facilities versus other facilities that are more gateways. Of course, the Port of Mobile is a gateway terminal. So some of the things that we are doing is encouraging companies that are importing cargo to come in and get their freight. At some point, depending on the size of the storm, we might restrict or stop the receiving of empty containers or export containers through our gate and things like that. But also, of course, just making sure that the customers understand what our plan is, what we're doing as far as operations go. It's it's important to try to take care of your customers in these situations, and I think that terminal operators tend to want to try to stay open as long as they can to help their customers. But those things unfortunately need to become secondary when it comes to storms of significant size. We also have things that we do, such as we're verifying all of our inventory levels for all of our equipment prior to the storm coming in. So when a storm is just approaching the Gulf, we're verifying our inventory levels. We're also prior to a storm coming in, we're fueling all of our machines. Anything and everything that holds fuel, we're filling them up, topping them off, and having our fuel vendor come and top up all of our storage tanks, so that if there's a bad scenario afterwards, that we're at least starting from a point where all of our machines are operational. We are identifying and securing all of our hazmat cargo first and foremost, and we are also doing things like securing our servers and doing all of our notifications to our headquarters and whatnot. Probably the most important thing I would say that we do as a terminal in preparation of the actual storm is hurricane strapping. And I'm sure that some of you are familiar with this, but if you're not, it is really just an act of strapping together stacks of containers, because I think, as everyone knows, containers can easily, especially empty containers, can easily become projectiles in a major storm. They can certainly float, and they will float away. We've had storms when Hurricane Katrina hit our terminal in New Orleans. We were finding containers that were about 10 miles away from the container terminal. So it's really something that we need to take seriously. So what we do here is, you can take a stack of empty containers that maybe you have a stack of 30 empty containers all stacked together, and one empty container is easily going to be picked up by a Category 3 storm and moved. But if you strap a top container on one corner to the bottom container on the far corner of that stack, and do that on each side, so you basically have an X shaped of straps on each side of a stack. Now, one empty container that weighs 3,000 pounds is now 30 containers altogether, weighing a lot more, and far more difficult for those things to be moved. Those strapping, it is timely, and it takes a lot of people. So it's something that you have to make a call on a good 48 hours to 72 hours before the storm is coming in. And we assess that risk as the storms come, and it does change from time to time. Some storms we will only strap empty containers. Some storms we will strap loaded containers as well. Sometimes we'll only strap lighter loaded containers and not heavier loaded containers, and things like that. But another important thing that we're doing there is we're photographing those efforts, so that after the storm you can show all the preparation that was taking place. Because as much of a pain as it is, we are all going to deal with claims and things like that if there's damage to cargo. So you do want to be able to show all the preparations that you took leading up to it. Just as a point of reference, so in the 12 years that APM Terminals Mobile has been open, we have had 3 hurricanes, and we've never lost a single container. Not a single empty container or loaded container has come down out of a stack. I'm going to knock on wood as I say that because I don't want to jinx myself. But it's something that we're proud of, and we haven't had any damage to our terminal from any of those storms. So we think that a lot of that has to do with the pre-work that we put into hurricane planning and whatnot. The other thing, and the most important thing that we have to keep in mind here as we do these things is these things do take a lot of people to accomplish, but these people also have to be given the opportunity to protect their loved ones and their personal property and their personal belongings. So sometimes when making these decisions and trying to not impact the customer as much as you otherwise would, you have to keep in mind that you have to give people time to be at home and get all of their personal affairs in order as well. So that should also be taken into account. And then post event, so just a few things that we do regionally is that we always have just basically hurricane kits, preparation or reaction kits. So we'll have a hurricane container that is filled with things like water, personal, generators, things, the basic type of things that would be needed in the event that there's some serious damage to the facility or even devastation. So that container is generally located someplace in different ports. So for example, maybe it would be in Houston, and then if there's a storm coming to Mobile, that container would be mobilized and be on the way to Mobile just as the storm is clearing, so that it gets into place as the timing comes in. We're also having things like satellite phones, which now as the technology gets better and better with mobile phones, it's not as needed, but under very severe circumstances, having a satellite phone so that you can communicate with all your stakeholders, your headquarters and whatnot is extremely important. So we have those things. And in the U.S. Coast Guard is also, they have 3 phases of post-storm that they would go through, where first they would allow certain people to come back onto the port to assess damage. Secondly, they would then allow full staff to return to prepare for reopening. And then they have a third step, which is commencing operations, and also all the follow-up with the Coast Guard for what went right, what went wrong, lessons learned, and things like that. So I think that probably covers everything. I mean, generally from a high view, so I'm happy to answer any questions as we go. But the only other thing that I would talk about here, maybe on the bullet points, is what's Plan B, and that for alternative facilities and things like that. So in that regard, that comes into, from my perspective, for reopening. And if the terminal is in such bad shape that we just can't possibly reopen it, we can't possibly serve our customers, we have to keep in mind that we have companies, especially our exporters, that probably have full warehouse space that needs to be cleared. So we need to have a place where we can accept cargoes, so that at least we can rehandle it and shift it back into the container terminal as we can clear things. But I think that pretty much covers it. There maybe just the environmental considerations that we talk about here. We've had instances where we've had storms and channel markers have been blown into ship channels and things like that. And of course, at least in that situation, the U.S. Coast Guard and the government entities are working on clearing those things. The Army Corps of Engineers. But from the terminal perspective, our focus is really on making sure that after the storm, that the terminal is still able to be up and running very quickly. And yeah, that's our focus. So I'll take a breath and hand it back to Rob, and so we need to go from here.
Awesome, thank you, Brian. That was more than a mouthful. That was a lot of detail. Thank you, man. A couple other comments on the points on the screen right now. Just in terms of labor relations and past experience in handling that, one thing I definitely would recommend to everyone on the call is having a a emergency communications plan that reaches the lowest level or the most frontline level of your workforce. And by that, I mean all the way down to the stevedore gangs that need to be contacted after a storm. Obviously, Brian was absolutely spot on in saying that there needs to be provisions made to make sure that all of your employees can take care of their families and that they're given the time and space to do that. However, given the emergency necessity of getting ports back online, it's also very important that you know how to reach and recover those employees after the storm. I can give you an example from our operations after Hurricane Maria. I think in trying to get the port of Ponce in the southern half of the island back up online, our teams realized very early on that there was no cell phone network, and the terrain was such that radio communications didn't reach that far into the hills in Puerto Rico. So we literally had to drive around the wrecked countryside in a pickup truck to each one of the stevedores' homes to try to make sure that they could get back to work and they could come down to form a full gang, because without full gangs, you can't run ships. So it's something that very basic level, not only obviously great technology like satellite phones, but really basic stuff like, okay, where does the head of this gang live? How do we get a hold of him? Where does his cousin live? How do we get a hold of him? And it's that level of basic planning. I think Brian would validate that. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a good point, Robin. And that's part of our hurricane plan as well, is communicating to all the people from top to bottom and making sure that we are talking to them after the storm, making sure that they're okay and that we have, of course, the proper workforce to come into place. The other thing that I would mention on this is in making your checklist for all the actions that you need to take pre and post storm, is that those action items should be assigned to particular positions within the terminal, right? That your managing director is going to be responsible for these things, your head of operations this, and so on and so forth. But it's so important to have secondary and tertiary people predetermined for each of those positions, because the storm doesn't care about our schedules, right? Our vacations or our trainings or whatever, and inevitably you're going to have people in key positions that are not at the terminal when a storm is bearing down on you, and you need to be able to work seamlessly there to make sure that all the preparations are being taken care of.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. At this point, in the interest of time, we're gonna move on to the next slide, which is going to provide a perspective from the liner operations side of the house. So with that, let's see if we can get there. There we go. Just a couple comments on trade lane management and the overall liner perspective on operating in stormy skies versus normal commerce. Todd, turn it over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's important that we understand what Brian's going through at the terminal from the terminal perspective, but as operators of the vessels, we're obviously important partners there. I think it's important that we are keeping the cargo moving, but each disaster has a different reality, and what we're trying to do is focus on keeping this regional supply chain undisrupted. How do we look at the situation when it's coming to fruition? Well, we have a network. Currently, we have 40 vessels that are covering South America, North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And part of the Caribbean for us is the north coast of South America, being Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, Venezuela, Colombia. So we have to be agile, understanding that storms do come, and where are we going to have vessels placed? So it's really important that we keep our crew and our vessels in safety, but they're positioned to be able to respond as quickly as possible. And so we want to ensure that the supply chain is as least disrupted as possible. And that supply chain takes on a whole new perspective when we have a disaster relief, because the cargo perhaps isn't the blue jeans of the apparel or cargo for the cruise ship industry or for the hotel industry. It's more about the basic necessities. We've even seen that during COVID with getting fast moving consumer products, because client or populations change their consumption patterns. So when we look at the cargo and the supply chain that's moving, we're trying to prioritize as much as possible the emergency goods. And when we look at that and planning the vessel calls, it's important to understand in each country, is there a backup terminal? It's very common that the capital city has the largest terminals, it has the best infrastructure, but what happens when that infrastructure is in peril or is in danger? So We've looked at Pisco in the southern part of Peru, obviously Ponce that Rob will speak to, Esmeraldas in the northern part of Ecuador, as well as Puerto Bolivar, to have a plan in place that the port authorities, the terminal operators in those secondary port cities are prepared as much as possible to handle additional vessel calls. To understand those vessels and what they're carrying is important, not just the historical vessels that came into port get priority, but what moves to the front of the line. It's important for us that in each country there is pilots that come out to receive our vessels and bring our vessels into harbor safely. You need to understand what your pilot and tug capacity is to receive the ships and to allow perhaps even captains to pilot the vessels into harbor if pilots are not available. We've also had opportunities where there is a barge system that receives our vessels in open water. So you can look at Big Creek in the southern part of Belize, or you can look at Turbo on the northern coast of Colombia. This is where our vessels arrive to harbor, but they do not come all the way into terminal. They are received by a barge that has a mobile crane on it that is able to receive containers onto the barge and bring a barge, which is much less problematic or complicated, into the terminal. So these are opportunities that allow, again, the cargo not to hit supply chain disruptions. We look at our partners along the way, which is local governments, to understand what is relief cargo. And what we usually set up are contracts. And in those contracts, we set aside space and equipment to manage the relief cargo, so that there's guaranteed space and there's guaranteed equipment to bring the emergency goods on board our vessels and then that reach your islands or reach your countries. So I think overall, we're very aware that this happens in the Caribbean Basin. As we operate the vessels and own many of them, we are prepared for the inevitable situation to have the vessels nearby, have equipment nearby. As Brian spoke to, equipment sometimes gets damaged in these situations. So what we're looking for is a clear operating environment. We understand that that's difficult initially. I think Rob will speak to in the initial stage of relief, but then what happens in the next stage. But overall, it's impacting your economies and our partnership in assisting a country after it's gone through a disaster is something that we've now experienced both on the Pacific coast of Central America, the Atlantic coast of Central America, as well as within the Caribbean. So I'd really want to put it at that point, open for questions at the end, but to understand that when we're approaching a post-disaster situation, we have to be agile and we have to open up lines of communication that historically may not have been there. Rob?
Thank you, Todd. That was fantastic. I think to capitalize on your point about shifting volumes to alternate ports of discharge, I mean, in some cases, as we have a lot of island nations on the phone right now, there may not be an obvious alternate port of discharge at all. and that's something we've definitely experienced in a number of different places, working in the Caribbean and working in Latin America as well.
Yes.
Where we have to look at, as Todd said, alternate forms of discharge, alternate forms of landing cargo, and really figuring out how to get the liner service or get the the overall trade lanes that feed into an island nation or an isolated nation, get it to the point where we can flow cargo into alternate ports that may before the storm have only been appropriate for pleasure craft or have maybe a ferry port. And
Correct.
we've done that a number of different times, and it's not easy to do in crisis, but it is easy. It is much easier to do if you have a solid process up front. And I bring that to the general attention of the group because that type of shift into alternate or backup ports that may not have what we would consider general liner support operations capacity as something you really need to take a look at when it comes to clearing the harbor or making sure there's enough draft. And we've done that. We actually did that quite a lot in USVI and in Puerto Rico, where we ended up having to take major offshore vessels into harbors or ramps that were really made for car ferries. And to the point where we had to do depth soundings ourselves to make sure that the harbor or the terminal, as it was certified enough by the Coast Guard or certified enough by the Port Authority to even allow for the insurance companies that insure these huge vessels to allow those vessels to berth. And it's I can tell you from personal experience, it's not a kind call when you have to call a liner operations insurer to say, hey, can we call this port we've never called before, and the draft might be enough to get the vessel in here, or it might not. And I think that's really not a call that you want to make to somebody like Todd, and it's not a decision that you want to make in crisis. So I think with that, Todd, any final comments before we move on to the next one?
Well, Robbie, bring up a good point. Where we had, for instance, service into Castries, St. Lucia for many years, and then you have Vieux Fort in the south, but maybe it's not even in St. Lucia. You need to have Paramaribo perhaps set up to help Georgetown and Guyana. And this is where, maybe it's a neighboring country and where an organization that we're speaking to today can create that conversation today under a non-stressed situation. We've had it with Puerto Cortes in Honduras and Santo Tomas Castilla in Guatemala, and how they've had to help each other out. Or in Corinto, Nicaragua, and Acajutla, El Salvador. Yes, they're different countries, but they needed to help each other. And we're living right now through a situation with COVID where land borders have been closed, where countries that have been used to be trading by truck have now had to move to ocean for the first time with many of their cargo.
Right.
So they've had to create a new relationship with electronic manifests and how to move the cargo as seamlessly as possible, because people at the destination are waiting, with such low patience for that cargo to arrive. So I think you bring up a good point. Maybe in a certain location, there isn't that backup terminal, there isn't that backup port, but hey, who is it then? Who's the most logical country or port to be that backup location?
Right.
Thanks, Rob.
Rob,
Appreciate it.
if I may interrupt the dialogue a little bit, we have a question, and I'd like to also make a comment. Thank you guys, by the way, Todd and Brian. Todd, I agree with everything that you guys have said on the preparation and so forth. We have amongst the audience today, for instance, the CEO of the Antigua and Barbuda Port Authority, who a few years ago pulled what I'd like to call a Winston Churchill by literally saving thousands of people from Barbuda by commandeering the civilian fleet and going to the sister island to get the people who were in the path of the hurricane. So that decision takes, like you say, planning, but it's also, contingent on what's going on. And it takes courage to make this type of decisions. But at the end of the day, they save lives. We have a question which I think is very relevant. And question says, what would the paperwork required to show that the port is safe after a storm be? Especially for obviously questions directed to the shipping lines. What do you guys need in order for me to show that my port is safe post the storm? That would be a great question. Thank you, Bishop, for that question.
Sure, I can lead off of that, and then I'll defer to my colleagues, just having some personal experience with it. I think that the major thing that the shipping lines look for is a certification from the equivalent of a Coast Guard or a coastal emergency authority to certify the port is open and safe. I think the IMO standards for most of that are pretty clear. And in terms of the paperwork itself, and the most common I've seen is just a basic hydrography report that covers the turning basin in the harbor in question that has to be certified by either a competent Coast Guard authority or a competent coastal management authority or a geographic survey authority to make sure that the Port Authority can say, hey, yes, the depth hasn't changed as much or it's acceptable. There are no hazards to marine navigation, and the channel is exactly as it's advertised. So those are the big three, I think, that are the most, the most contingency oriented. How that's done is another good question. So I know that the assets that are capable of doing that type of hydrography are not things that are generally on demand across the Caribbean basin on a regular basis, and they're not always available kind of immediately after a storm. So, for example, I think we had to bring or help bring the hydrography assets out of Miami in cooperation with a couple of partners into Freeport, to clear the Freeport Channel. I can speak personally. I was out in a kayak with a depth finder in some of the small islands off of Puerto Rico, trying to make sure that there were no marine hazards to bring in some specialized vessels. And in other cases, we've had NOAA vessels that are specially equipped to do this kind of thing, like the NOAA vessel Thomas Jefferson, which is a bit of a one in the world asset. But there are many different either commercial providers or government providers of that type of service. However, a solid hydrography survey is what's really needed for the Port Authorities to certify to liner services like Sealand and MAERSK that a port in a channel is actually safe to work through. And it's also something that it's really, really important to work with the terminal operators on, because many times the terminal operators will actually know where there are existing hazards and not. And maybe they were there before a storm, and maybe they were not. But the terminal operator and the port operator is really going to know best what's in their basin already, and how those hazards may or may not have shifted during the storm. So that's my best advice. Todd and Brian, any quick comments on that?
Yeah, just maybe from the terminal side, I think that's spot on. I mean, from anything, the terminal is going to be aware if there's anything wrong with the ship channel or the turning basin or anything alongside the terminal. And then, of course, just confirming that you have functionality of your ship-to-shore cranes and basic equipment that you need to conduct stevedoring operations.
Great. And I think if there's further questions on it, obviously after the session, I think we can help anyone interested in getting in touch with the types of service providers that can do that kind of thing regionally. It's really healthy and is going to help you and help us if those types of relationships and framework agreements are in place before the storm ever happens, so we don't have to scramble in crisis. Okay, next one, I think. We're going to get into some other fun stuff. All right, post-disaster economics. This is where we get to talk about supply chains in crisis. And I'm sure that everybody on the Port Authority and terminal operations side of this session is well aware of everything that's on the left-hand side of the screen in terms of what goes on after a hurricane or after a major natural disaster. What I'd like to do in this slide is point out how all those points are kind of interrelated, and how the confluence of all of those circumstances or impacts to a port system after a storm or after a natural disaster can really bring about a kind of a disaster within a disaster. And just to review kind of the points on the slide, and especially in island economies and in smaller economies, the assets that a port authority or a terminal operator has at its disposal are right sized for the economy during blue skies. So if you're looking at an island or island nation or a smaller Latin American or Caribbean nation that depends a lot on tourism or depends a lot on a specific type of industry, you're going to have the transport assets that are right sized for that economy. You're not going to have the transport assets by just natural attrition that would be able to handle massive influxes in aid, and you're not going to have a lot of spares. So that just doesn't make any economic sense. But like Brian said, hurricanes don't care about economic sense. And I think one thing we've seen time and again is that port authorities and really economic planners and transport planners in many island nations underestimate the stresses and the other factors that really contribute to what becomes logistics system failure right after a storm, not due to any fault of any human, but due to the fault of largely poor planning or lack of planning to figure out what the post-disaster economy really needs. So I think a good example I can give you is the second bullet here: equipment use cases in terms of how flat racks are used, how trailers are used, how chassis and trucks are used to make cargo flow through gateway terminals or flow through terminals generally changes drastically after a storm. And what I mean by that is that the destinations themselves change in many cases, whereas for the most part in normal commerce circumstances, you've got containers or break bulk trucks coming off of the terminal with cargo on board. They're dropping off at a warehouse with a dock high offload facility, or they're dropping off at businesses whose business it is to make that cargo flow. When you're talking about crisis operations or emergency response, the entire game has changed, where the destinations of much of the aid and relief that flows through these types of terminals goes from businesses that are now shut due to the disaster or have a massive downturn in the retail market to emergency responders, first responders, government agencies, and civil society participants like churches, schools, and hospitals, where they just don't have the facilities to quickly receive offload, and turnaround equipment. And what that turns into is long turnaround times and massive amounts of pressure on very limited assets. So where it takes, say, maybe 20 to 25 minutes to offload 22 pallets out of a standard container at a dock-high facility with a forklift, it can take 6 to 7 hours to offload the same size of container by hand without a dock-high facility, say at a church, at a school, at a hospital. And what that does is it pressurizes and it increases the turnaround time for your assets and leads to transport system failure, which is exactly what we saw in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria in San Juan. We had about a 4,000 container backup in the first 10 days. And it's one of the reasons my team was called down to help clear that backup and stand up emergency cross-dock operations across the island. So I think that's one good use case to look at. The second is price bubble consideration. Unfortunately, what you're going to see in a lot of post-disaster recovery operations is a massive influx of all of our friends in the NGO and emergency aid communities and other government agencies that will make fast friends with everyone here on the Port Authority side, but also create demands on the transport system that usually don't exist. And unfortunately, just due to the flexibility and the overall very, very time-sensitive mission of many of these first responders, they're going to snap up as many transport assets and personnel as they possibly can. And unfortunately, what that does in many respects, and this is something I know that the NGO and aid community is cognizant of, is it creates transport service bubbles and effectively drives up the cost of truck rental, of chassis rental, of any sort of transport asset, and can actually price local businesses right out of the market and make them fail. So I've got a number of different anecdotal examples I can share with anyone who's interested in how that's happened and how actually, unfortunately, aid agencies in doing what they do best have a lot of unintended consequences that can be managed with, I think, a couple spoonfuls of good prior planning. That kind of comments on the next bullet with relief versus commerce competition. It's something that I know is right in the front of many of the Port Authority's minds is how to manage all these new stakeholders that come in or normally come in right after a storm. I covered a little bit on the unintended consequences of local businesses caused by aid and reconstruction. I think it's also pretty important to note that stakeholder management is one thing and it's easy or easier under blue skies. Under gray skies, everything's in crisis. And though you may be making quite a number of new friends, not all those new friends are going to stay. So a lot of the aid agencies, a lot of the influx of first responders may cause a lot more stress on not just your transport, but also your lodging, your overall food and life support provisions. And all of them are there to help for sure. But unless you have a plan on paper beforehand to make sure you can manage those stakeholders, things do get pretty tense. And I know Curtis and I shared some of that tension with the Bahamian authorities on their behalf, operating in the Bahamas after Dorian, and what wasn't perhaps as smooth as it could have been. So the point there, I think, is that considering at least a plan for, if not assets, to make sure that a temporary and parallel infrastructure can be created after natural disasters or crises to kind of take the pressure off of traditional transport assets and thereby take the pressure off of the commercial economy. Because let's face it, I mean, certainly on our side as a commercial corporation and on your side as the folks in charge of the port authorities, I think it's best that we get back to business as usual as fast as possible in order to support the communities that we're really there to provide support to. And in order to do that, it's really necessary that we have a parallel plan in place to take that pressure off of the businesses and off of the communities that would otherwise be really, really acute from the overall emergency response effort that happens, especially in island economies. So I think that's the priority. It's on reducing economic drag. If there is a strategic goal after any natural disaster, it is reducing the economic drag so the economy itself can grind back to life and people can get back to their livelihoods. So on the end of this slide here, I'd like to draw your attention to the chart on the right. This is just a general, I don't think it's by any means based on exact volumes, but it's a general trend, the kind of benchmark that we see definitely in island economies following natural disasters, but also in smaller economies that don't have many ports of ingress. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner where there's just the green bubble and the apex, that's when the natural disaster happens. And right after it happens, you're going to see the retail obviously fall through the floor, where all businesses stop, where the disaster kind of takes its toll. People are kind of recovering, getting out of their homes. and you'll see a large-scale drop in volumes and retail coming imports through your terminals, through your gateways, and you'll see a huge spike in disaster relief and aid cargo, whether that's water, shelter, different types of power generation equipment, perhaps cargoes that maybe your terminals are not used to handling at such volume will start coming in via both sea and air once things are coming back online. And then you'll see those two bell curves reverse themselves they'll start to reverse themselves after about 45 to 60 days once you're past the disaster, if you have a good plan in place and your government emergency authorities also are working with you. What I definitely draw your attention to here is this yellow circle in the middle, where an unintended but natural consequence of all these three types of cargo, retail, reconstruction, and relief, come together to form the perfect storm. And what that means generally is, as you've got a larger influx of reconstruction cargo to bring in things like drywall, slate roofs, anything that's involved in commercial reconstruction or reconditioning, debris removal is a really big one that we've seen people forget to plan for. A lot of that can lead to a kind of disaster within a disaster between 60 and 90 days after a natural disaster happens, that also causes the transport infrastructure, either airport or ocean port, to fall in its face. And unfortunately, that's a huge drag on the overall economic recovery of many island nations that's still actually going on to this day, certainly after Maria and in more limited aspects after Hurricane Dorian. We'd like to help everyone on the call plan for and avoid this type of drag and kind of disaster within a disaster at the 90-day mark after things start picking up on the reconstruction end. I think to close this slide, if you would think for a moment to take a much larger view of what's going on in the world right now when it comes to COVID, you could also apply these same general trends to what's going on with the retail markets, the market and the overall transport needs for personal protective equipment, and the coming enormous requirements for the overall distribution via cold chain and other specialized transports for the vaccine rollout that may or may not happen, hopefully, in the next 18 to 24 months. On a global scale, at least in my anecdotal opinion, we're looking at a very similar type of risk area in global transport, not just in regional or localized transport, to look at how these three types of trends really come together, and are we going to be prepared for that? So whether or not you have a hurricane on your hands or not, this same type of risk matrix and risk model is coming at pretty much everybody on this call, and it's good to start planning together for it now to make sure it doesn't surprise us. Jorge, any questions? I know that's a lot of data. I'm conscious of time here.
Rob, this is Mona from the off. Appreciate your comment. I just wanted to give you a heads up that we have approximately 5 more minutes for your presentation, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Yep, no problem. Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So planning, blue skies versus gray skies. I think we'll just move to some anecdotal kind of lessons learned on how to pair with one another as cooperative port authorities. In looking at this slide, what I draw your attention to here in the left-hand side is the transit time analysis that we put up for some of the work we did with the Bahamian authorities and Bahamian Port Authority following Hurricane Dorian to figure out, okay, this time there wasn't that much preparation or pre-positioning work done. Next time, hopefully there will be. And what we did for the Bahamas is take a look at what are the alternate ports or alternate pre-positioning locations where A, there is liner service or there is break bulk service and there is air service available into the location that might get hit, such as the Bahamas did, and B, what are your windows for transport? So looking at Jacksonville on the right-hand side for 2 days transit time, from Mobile, where Brian sits, 3 days transit time into Freeport, and then flowing through Freeport into the many islands in the Bahamian chain. And we actually left Miami off of this overall planning for pre-positioning, largely because of where you see the two big hurricane red dots in the center and the right-hand side of the screen. And I bring that up because it's not enough really to plan on just what happens right after the storm. It has to have your planning efforts and your overall partnership efforts to figure out who your alternates are, or where your pre-positioned supplies may be, has to take into account the overall trend and track of the storms that hit your particular area, whether that's in the Lesser Antilles, whether it's in the Greater Antilles, in the Bahamas, or in the larger Caribbean basin. And what I mean by that is we took Miami off the list, though it's obvious that Miami is a fantastic trading partner, trading port for the Bahamas, as is the major gateway for reaching the Bahamas on a good day. But on a bad day, a hurricane that blasts through Nassau and Freeport is going to go right onto Miami. and either cause major impacts to that trade infrastructure and terminal infrastructure, but also delay reaction time between 24 and 72 hours when it's most critical to get supplies in via air or via sea. So we advise the Bahamian authorities to actually discount Miami in their overall emergency plans and look at it for a reconstruction hub as an alternate port rather than just going and depending on one kind of putting their eggs all in one basket. We'd love to be able to help the other port authorities and nations on this call figure out what your good, kind of sibling or partner port looks like in terms of overall pre-positioning, and either leverage our facilities or our partners' facilities to make that happen. But it is very important that you're able to flow supplies and have a plan to flow emergency supplies through your gateways within 24 to 36 hours after the storm. And on this, I think I'm going to leave it with just one or two comments on here. We covered earlier that there is a requirement to plan for alternate ports. Some of the lessons learned we've highlighted here, that smaller ports and airports lack the high capacity offload equipment, but are most proximate to survivors many times. And traditional liner service may not be able to reach populations if ports are disconnected from the larger kind of urban areas that they serve. We've seen this in many different disasters where even though a terminal may be up and operating, if the raised bridge or the road between that terminal or the gateway cannot reach by truck or cannot reach by ferry the populations that it serves, then it's effectively useless in overall disaster response until it's restored. So figuring out how to have that alternate ingress port or port of entry available is incredibly important, as it is to have alternate ways of getting ground traffic or bridge traffic kind of back up and running right after a storm. And I think with that, I'll just cover a couple of different quick ones on specific lessons learned for Hurricane Maria. This is a shot of the Port of Ponce, which Todd and I both mentioned about 3-4 weeks, I believe, after Hurricane Maria came through Puerto Rico. These are definitely two ships that you probably never want to see in your port. One is a U.S. naval vessel called the USNS Britain that was bringing in a number of National Guard helicopters and armored trucks and other major transport assets the U.S. military deployed to Puerto Rico. And the one on the right is the MV Cotobacat. If you see on the lower right-hand side, you'll see the stacks of break bulk cargo. Each one of those stacks is a 1-ton pallet of water. And we actually had to do 10,000 1-ton pallets of water because the labor availability on shore side was such that we couldn't do containerized traffic into Ponce at the time and had to offload 10,000 single pallets onto flatbed trucks for direct delivery into communities all throughout Puerto Rico during that operation. It was incredibly labor intensive, but it was the only thing that was going to work. And I definitely encourage everyone on the call here to kind of consider worst case scenarios in terms of what types of vessels are going to have to come in, what shore-based facilities you have, and what the throughput's going to look like in terms of asset availability on the shore side to ensure fast offload. Next one is a little bit getting creative. This is in an inland container depot that we created off of an abandoned airstrip in eastern Puerto Rico after Maria. This one took a lot of creativity to get going. As you'll see, some ground cranes and mobile truck docks. I think we moved more than 8,000 FFE through this thing and some 20,000 pallets of water during the operation after Hurricane Maria. It became quite the kind of the press, a bit of press attention after things got revealed that we were working out of an airport rather than a seaport to run container traffic. But it's just a good example of how you have to use all infrastructure that you have at your disposal, as I'm sure the Puerto Rican government did, and definitely the Bahamian government did after Hurricane Dorian. And lastly, you never know what your equipment's going to end up doing. This is a 20-footer that I know Curtis has probably seen running around Freeport in the Bahamas. It has a reverse osmosis machine mounted in the back of it, and it's still, I believe, still being used today to deliver fresh water to isolated communities or underserved communities in the Bahamas. So just because everyone's used to using 20s for palletized cargo and going to a dock-high facility and dropping off commerce, it doesn't mean that you can't do it quite a lot with a big steel box. So I encourage everyone on the phone to integrate that type of kind of entrepreneurial planning spirit and flexibility into their overall emergency action plans and use what you have at hand. And I think with that, I'm going to close and take Q&A here. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and open the floor to Jorge.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you both to Brian and Todd for your time and your presentations. It's obvious that we're all on the same page. I really admire that MAERSK takes the time to do a yearly review of your emergency response plans, at least in the terminal, as was explained. This is vital and very, very important. As you know, as Kim Osborne said in the opening, we're working on a disaster mismanagement, disaster risk management project with Caribbean port authorities, and we'll start implementing heavy parts of that this year. I am also sort of it was refreshing to hear that the ports in this during this COVID-19 thing had two priorities. On the one hand, was to prevent contagion and be safe and implement all the protocols of safety. But on the other hand, is to keep the trade moving, is to keep that supply chain fast and efficient and moving along. The backup terminal, Rob, that you and I have talked about, I think is a brilliant idea, and it's something that I'm sure this stakeholders here will appreciate the possibility of having somebody advise on how to create this plan B, this backup terminal, if unavailable in their own country. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was that yellow circle, that famous yellow circle that is in your slide, where this is, and I say this with my heart in my hand, and that is in I'm being Mexican, and when we have a disaster, is it in that circle is when you get the corruption and the because there's limited number of inland vehicles to carry all this stuff that is now at the port, plus the usual. And this is a difficult time, and I would like to remind everyone present that Rob is happy to talk to you about their experience on how to best deal with that yellow circle. We do have some specific questions, so I'll make them to you, and I don't know if who wants to sort of field them, but they about.
I see that Darwin raised his hand.
Yes, I'm about to. I was
Okay.
trying to, and if you can do it for me, I'd appreciate it. I was trying to
Yes.
unmute Darwin so that he can ask his question
He is
directly.
now, Darwin, my brother, my friend, you are now unmuted.
Hi, Mona. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Darwin, please introduce yourself to the crowd. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Darwin Telemac. I'm the CEO of the Antigua Port Authority. I am also on with my chairman is also on board. I am the vice chairman of the Port Management Association of the Caribbean, Mr. St. John, who is on here as well. He is the chairman. And I'm also the chairman of the OECS Port Committee, which is a smaller grouping, and the vice chairman of the CIP, which is the OAS. So I work closely with Jorge and Mona and the team there. I am actually quite touched by what I see, because in everything that was presented, what we've seen is innovation, and it speaks to the fact that large or small, the need for innovation is always there. And I mean, that airport airstrip, container strip, that is just brilliant. And I mean, that is necessity is the mother of invention. And you can certainly prove that with that. But we do have some concerns. One of them is we have a challenge in our region. And that's true at all ports all over the world with unionized labor and the lack of flexibility. And I saw that point there when you inserted in the presentation that part of the strategy has to be to work around getting flexible work schedules, to try to get the unions to understand that things are not going to be the same. And we have a contract, yes, that says it's supposed to flow this way. So I'd like to get some feedback on how that was able to come about. And second, as small islands, we are not connected by landmass where we can have a new crane or a new crane operator drive across to meet us. We literally have to depend on each other. And by doing so, I'd also like to find out whether you guys have had any challenges in engaging the unions to provide for what we would term as an auxiliary port workforce, people coming from nearby islands, different states, to support the effort at an impacted port. and how that was able to come about, because that is something we have been toying around with and something that we truly believe is absolutely necessary.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think we can address those questions in two parts. And Brian, on the first one with working with the unions on flexible labor hours or flexible workforce engagement, would you be able to comment on that at all from your own plan and experience?
Yeah, I can. What we see in terms of when the unions start to be a little bit less flexible and maybe push back a little bit more, it really comes back to what you talked about, Rob, in terms of just proactive communication. That making sure that they know what your plan is going in, that they know some of the measures that you're going to be taking that are time consuming, how many people you're going to need this day and that day. I think it's also important to show that through your actions of, let's say, when you're going to stop cargo operations or when you're going to stop receiving export cargoes in through your gates or things like that, you're doing that in a timely manner so that they can see that you're giving them time to handle their personal affairs as well as handle the business affairs of the terminal. So the more that we proactively communicate, first and foremost, it allows us that opportunity to gauge how they feel about the plan and whether you're going to run into any issues of inflexibility. But then, of course, just being able to, on the backside, look them in the eye and say that we looked out for your personal best interests as well as the protection of the port. And I mean, the last thing I'd say is, in my experience, and maybe Mobile can relate a little bit to some of the island ports, in that Mobile's not a huge metropolitan area. It's not a, I mean, it's a rather small community when you look at some of the other major ports around the U.S. And what I mean by that is the people that work here really depend on the port for their livelihoods. They want to protect the business flow. They want to protect the reputation of the terminal and of the port. So that is an additional incentive for them to work with us when it's times of crisis like this.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. I think just to comment, sir, on your other question about auxiliary workforces and kind of labor relations generally, two things jump to mind. One, from a licensure perspective, one thing that we have run into in a number of different occasions is in many different port and terminal operations, there are only a certain number of trucking organizations or trucking dispatch organizations that are allowed to do business on terminal. And that does present a pretty serious shortage or an artificial, what I call an artificial shortage in disaster response situations, where if you only have 3 companies or 3 trucking companies that are allowed to run trucks through the terminal, and yet there are 10 trucking companies in your country or in the immediate area, that's kind of an artificial regulatory barrier to overall response and efficiency. So looking at either issuing temporary or putting in place preparatory agreements with other trucking companies or other support vendors in advance as part of your plan to activate those in crisis is really, really helpful, just to make sure that there is no artificial shortage of equipment or artificial shortage of transport capacity. So that's one we've run into that we did help the Puerto Rican Port Authority solve kind of early on. In terms of workforce availability and flexibility, it really is different in every case, and we've looked at everything from bringing in what we call kind of an expeditionary workforce that would be obviously not citizens of the country that we'd be working in at the time, but we would only be there for a temporary length of time, to and the insurance issues that kind of surround that are very local and very circumstantial in nature, to working with port authorities to put in place what I'd call kind of an emergency tariff schedule, where it is understood by the unionized labor organizations that okay, here's your rate for break bulk cargo under blue skies, here's your rate for mechanized cargo under blue skies, and here's your rate for the same types of cargo under storm conditions or under extreme conditions in emergency response. And incentivizing those unions with those types of measures actually has proven quite effective. So they at least know up front that yes, they're going to get paid, and here's what they're going to get paid to manage their expectations overall. So just to make sure that they, as Brian said, because they depend on the port for their livelihood, that we can actually engage them in a positive way for that. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes. Well, can I just ask one quick follow-up? Those weight scales that you negotiated or you went to negotiate, is that blue skies would be lower than gray skies, or how would that work?
Yeah, so usually it is, say it was, I think in Puerto Rico, it was $33 an hour unionized labor for mechanized and $18 for break bulk cargo. And in gray skies or post disaster, I think it went up like 15% for each, and that was the overall flat tariff increase. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's very, very good, because that's at least that's a benchmark that we can put in place. That's a very, very good point.
And you can use it for budgetary planning too. So if you have your general hours and your throughput, you can kind of add 15% on top of that and kind of get what you think you're going to have to budget for annually. It's very helpful.
Right, and then I'm sorry, Jorge, but
There's a couple more questions, but go ahead.
in terms of the 15%, that was factored into the increased volumes, or did you have to follow up with additional tariff adjustments?
There were some additional tariff adjustments that we saw in Puerto Rico following the storm, but I did not note any in the Bahamas. And obviously, those were taken by the Port Authority, not by anybody from MAERSK, since that's a government decision overall. But
Right.
I think there were a couple of extra tariffs, but they're temporary in nature. A lot of what I think it does have to be planned for as well is the offset and overall tax revenue loss that comes in after a storm, because many times, in the interest of forcing emergency aid through ports, governments will often drop the tariff on imports of emergency supplies and overall cargo that's related to emergency response, as had to be the case in the Bahamas. It had to be the case elsewhere as well. And that results in an overall taxable revenue loss for the Port Authority in the interest of emergency response. And I think it's something that does have to be offset in terms of tariffs or other optional fees that can be levied elsewhere on the trade flows to make sure that you don't lose a massive amount of revenue that is going to negatively impact your overall annual budget in a way that you may not be able to offset or plan for in the future.
Good stuff.
Thank you both. Thank you, Darwin. I'm going to ask Mona to please open up the mic for Bish and John. Bish, instead of me reading your questions, since we're all just a small group here and we're all friends and know each other, I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot, and that way you can ask the question. And then I see that Curtis Dennings has another question, so perhaps we could just use this methodology that we're just opening up your mics for the question. Bishan, are you there?
Bishan should be unmuted.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Okay.
Again, please introduce yourself, Bishan, so they get a reference where you're coming from.
Yes, first let me just thank you for putting together this panel. Really, as Darwin said, it's really impressive that what you do. One of the things though I think that we have to do is have continuous dialogue. You know, we have to build bonds and relationships and goodwill. Yes, it's good that we're doing this now, but we probably might not meet each other again until July next year, unless there's a disaster. And I think we need to do better than that. We can do better, and we probably owe it to our citizens to do better. And I am committed as chairman of PMAC to work towards that goal with the OAS and then all the other stakeholders, CDMA, whoever, and the shipping lines, companies, whoever. You know, I listened clearly, and as you know, we are focused on a small island state as we are, and we do have unique challenges. I saw you were able to do a makeshift container yard on an airstrip, and we could probably do that in St. Vincent and some islands, and we'll have 2 airports. But one of the things that has always hampered our rebuilding process is the availability of storage space.
Right.
We have always had containers come in, and we just do not have the storage space to open the containers. We have tried innovative, cost-effective ways of building sheds, but it always ends up that we have these containers, and somehow they always get misplaced, 40, 60 containers. So there are different challenges that I'm seeing that would like to see how you have dealt with them. One, for example, is your your tallying system, how were you effectively able to say what you have and where when you make these make do terminals? What system is it, a manual system, or were you able to move your system that you had in place to tally properly what container is where? And during the logistics like that, I'm very interested to see how a small island state can conquer that, because I know, and Darwin would know, that in some of the islands they had risk, they had water, they had supplies. They just did not know where the supplies were, in which container, and in some instances, the containers were buried deep under, as you said, blue jeans. So how did you manage that? Was it done from the offloading of the ship, or was it done at the? How was it managed?
So I think we can speak a little bit in two formats to this: one on the emergency response side, and one on the terminal side from Brian. And I'll just make quick comments first. I think, to your point, sir, yes, it is a perennial issue that we see in terms of expeditionary storage or pop-up storage capacity that is never in place when certainly the disaster strikes, or is quite hard to muster quickly after the disaster is over. And what I'd say to that is we do have plans in place to assist partners with that. There's actually a name for it in MAERSK. It's called the Gray Skies Package. And Brian has the, I guess, the honor, and I thank him continuing through this, for playing host to part of it in Mobile. So the Gray Skies Package on MAERSK side is a suite of mobile cross docks, generators, mobile light towers, satellite communications gear, and a mobile or expeditionary warehouse and property management system that is kind of exactly, sir, what you're talking about in a box. It's a fleet of containers along with enough equipment to create a full service expeditionary warehouse and storage facility on the middle of an airstrip or a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. And it's put on a ship and discharged, or put on an aircraft and discharged within 24 to 36 hours after we get called. So yes, can it be done? For sure. Does it take some partnership to do? Absolutely. And some things we've done with Curtis's organization is we've donated containers in the past for pre-positioning. And I think one thing we've done quite successfully in Puerto Rico and elsewhere is right after a disaster, if we have a yard, as Brian does on this phone call, or as any of our other terminal locations do across the region, we can actually dedicate a fleet of empty containers to serve as inland transfer or inland cross-dock and transit cargo hubs for the duration of their disaster response, for say 60 to 90 days. So we did this to a limited extent in the Bahamas. We definitely did it in Puerto Rico, and we've looked to do it elsewhere and plan for it. So do the assets exist? For sure. Do the assets exist to manage cargo? Definitely. And to your point about how do we account for it? Normally, we work in tandem with the Port Authority to do direct discharge off the vessels of priority cargo, and work with Todd's side on the liner service side to make sure that those more valuable commodities or emergency commodities have priority loading in the stacks on the vessel for first discharge, so we can get them off the vessel and expedited for overall distribution or transit storage on the island elsewhere. Todd and Brian, do you have any kind of very short comments on that?
Yeah, I could add a few words of wisdom there. And there is an ability to priority stow most emergency related containers on deck, but also to have the clearance process prior to vessel arrival where possible.
Yep.
And sometimes that isn't happening. We can also realize that many times government or relief aid is not directly interacting with Sealand as the vessel operator. It's through a freight forwarder, or it's through an organization that has been let's say asked to assist the government, and there we are in relationship with that freight forwarder. And so therefore it is a secondary relationship with what's happening in the country on the ground. So I think it's important with the question about how do we prioritize cargo. Of course, we want to understand what emergency goods are needed, but it's also a freight forwarder or a cargo handling agent who has a contractual agreement with the shipping line will get that space based on their contractual agreement with the shipping line. So that would be the question I would ask. Do you have a contractual relationship with the shipping line that's coming with relief goods? If so, show me that service contract so that I can actually see that the cargo is, space and equipment is being provided to those, to that contract. That's normally how we're working. Obviously, when there's an additional vessel that is there specifically for aid purposes, that's something more of on a charter basis, which would more refer to you, Rob.
Yeah, I completely agree, Todd. And your point about freight forwarding and customs clearance is one of the headaches we deal with day in, day out when it comes to emergency relief. Is not just knowing where the cargo is, but getting it through the paperwork drill of getting it out of the port is one of the highest hurdles. And when you have communication systems down, power out, it just makes that issue much harder. So thank you for the comments, Brian. Anything quickly?
Yeah, very quickly, just as part of a plan, there are a lot of fancy tools and things out there for operating terminals now that most places take advantage of, and I think that a lot of us can't imagine life without them. We had the, I guess, unfortunate experience going through a cyber attack a few years ago where that just came to a grinding halt, and what we learned there is that terminal operations did exist prior to having all these fancy computer systems, and people did have ways of doing it. So it's important as part of your plan to be prepared that if you have to go to pen and paper, that's what you've got to do. But also making sure within your plan that you're taking extra special precautions to protect certain pieces of hardware, right? Things like just a handful of laptops, your two-way radios, things like that. So basic communications and your ability to keep some type of an inventory, albeit manual, and maybe just using a two-way radio to radio that information back to somebody that's sitting in front of an Excel spreadsheet is something that you may have to do. So it's important to have those practices in place prior to the storm.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. Those are really good points as well. You have to plan for the basics. I mean, assume you can do what you can with digital, but plan for the basics as well. Does that answer your question? I think that's the end of that response.
Gentlemen, if this is Mona again, if okay with you, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Curtis Denny, who's joining us from Sedema. He has a question. So Curtis, I will unmute your mic.
If I may, Curtis, before you you ask your question, and welcome again. Thank you, Rob and Todd and Brian, and for your participation. I don't want to interrupt the dialogue and the questions, and I know that Curtis has one. I need to, unfortunately, go duty calls. I need to log on to another meeting, a political in nature, and give a report there. But I do not want. I want to thank you all for your participation. Of course, Rob and with Todd and Brian will follow up from here. But so I leave now. I leave it in the more capable hands of Mona Swoboda and mine. And, gentlemen, I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Jorge.
Curtis.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Hi, Rob, what's up?
Hey, man.
Yes. Just that I'm just thinking here of a couple of things here. Remember in Abaco, the ports was practically decimated, and all issues regarding to ISPS and security and customs were they were not present, so that controlling element of the environment was missing. I'm just wondering if how do carriers would react to such an environment when you have that type of decimation? And two, there was another carrier also committed to bring in a number of containers that practically would have overwhelmed the environment. And you remember us discussing probably setting up a cross-docking facility. So I'm just wondering here of the on-ground relationships. I know the previous person spoke about contractual agreements, etc., but the underground having the cargo on the ground with the carrier, the national stakeholders, the emergency responders, that's different from the contractual arrangement. How do you respond in such an environment when in Abaco the need was so desperate that you needed to get that cargo and facilitate that cargo out from the port environment?
Yeah, Curtis, I remember being there with you. That was probably the worst of all circumstances in Marsh Harbor. I can say that with a great deal of confidence. From the, I definitely like Todd to comment on this too, but from the emergency response side, one thing that we had proposed to the Bahamian authorities was doing an alternate or pre-clearance in Nassau or in an alternate port that had customs authorities, by being able to transmit the manifests and transmit the bills of lading to the standard port authority, but have the clearance actually happen in an alternate location in March Harbor. Because unfortunately, the Bahamian authorities just weren't able to deploy as many customs officers as they would have liked into the disaster, even though the delivery capacity may have been there to an extent. A lot of what happened was the system fell in its face because there wasn't an ability to clear through customs and take care of the correct import procedures. So I think doing that virtually in the future may be an option for port authorities. If they can't deploy a no-kidding customs officer, do we have the trusted networks and the trusted relationships that would allow for virtual clearance under exceptional circumstances where there's not a customs officer on site, which we have done in the past. And the other one is really having the liner service or having the logistics partner work with the customs folks to get them out there physically, and we have worked that as well in a couple of different places. In Mozambique actually comes to mind. A couple of things we did in Cyclone Idai in 2019. So I think to your point, Curtis, it is both a systems and a equipment issue. When it comes to getting cargo through a terminal like what happened in Marsh Harbor, I think all bets go out the window when the entire port gets wiped off the face of the earth, and you kind of have to start from scratch. I mean, liner services are in a tough spot because of the support infrastructure required to bring larger ships in. So I'd say in that respect, it's going to be up to the port authority to work with the liner service or to work with a logistics organization like us to figure out what type of equipment needs to be brought in, and also, to your point, have framework agreements or contracts in place in advance of the storm to, one, cut down on costs, and two, speed up service delivery. And that's one thing we saw in the Bahamas, is that everyone was getting to know each other for the first time 2 days after the storm in Marsh Harbor when the mud was still underwater. So I think that was, planning and preparation would have been the saving grace of that operation, but unfortunately we didn't get to do it. Todd, any comments on that?
Yeah, I would say that look at your state of emergency. If your country has issued a state of emergency, what liberties are then provided for the clearance of cargo? And maybe through using the state of emergency, it will speak to the customs officials. You can also look at how cargo is consigned. If it's consigned to a government agency, how can that then move quicker than being consigned to perhaps a private or a non-government agency? And we have the ability, Sealand, as a shipping line, we have the ability to transfer the manifest electronically anywhere based on the requirements that may be offered to us. To a Nassau is for a vessel arriving to the northern part of the Bahamas, or so that electronic manifest ability to be able to go through the documents electronically wherever that official may be, even working from a satellite workstation, is possible. And I think that's what you should challenge yourself now in a time of non-disaster. How would you take a Sealand vessel arriving, and how would you clear it with no systems? And go through that drill and understand where the gaps are, and that would probably allow you to see where the gaps are the greatest. That's what I would add.
Awesome, thank you, Todd.
Rob, I just have one more follow-up question. Let me just formally introduce myself. I'm Curtis Denny. I'm at CIDEMA, logistics specialist. The experience again in the Bahamas also showed where carriers charge demurrage charges to the state when the state didn't have the capacity to clear the volume of cargo that that was landed through the system because of the backlogging, the logistics challenges, distributional, land challenges, communication. So there were so many logistical challenges that inhibited that type of movement. Is there type of corporate social responsibility on the part of liners to look at the context of the environment and to make an informed decision relative to the greater societal good while balancing the needs of the carrier? Because charging a state demurrage charges that has already they've been impacted. So you're now inflicting more damage upon a state that has already been exposed already.
Yes, Curtis. So I know exactly the situation and exactly the carrier you're speaking about. It is not the first time we've seen this in terms of the demurrage or detention charges stacking up on the bank accounts of an already impacted government that is already kind of reeling from the disaster in the first place. There's two solutions to this. Is one, just as Todd said, making sure that the federal authorities of the impacted government have a direct service agreement with the carrier. And I know that did not happen in the Bahamas, or it did not happen quickly enough in the Bahamas to solve the issue you're talking about. But a little bit of planning on behalf of the government emergency authorities with the liners to put that type of emergency waiver in place will save you a great deal of money. That's one. Two, the ensuring that the fast throughput or cross dock of cargo through even an emergency port, as what was going on in Marsh Harbor, would also have really changed the game there. And I know, Curtis, you and I worked to see if we could actually get a fleet of MAERSK containers to be landed in Marsh Harbor to kind of be the transition base or be the inland fleet to run stuff around. Unfortunately, we couldn't get approval for that from the folks in Bahamas. But I think that type of idea, where you do have an agreement with a logistics organization like us or one of your existing partners to have that type of standby fleet of empty boxes that can be rushed into a location, so you don't end up enduring those demurrage or detention charges from a liner service that may not grant you a waiver. So just getting it out of the boxes that would cost you money and into boxes that would not cost you money, I think that would be the setup that would be most optimal. And if not, then putting an arrangement in place with the liner services so there is that waiver or the option to exercise a waiver in place in emergency circumstances prior to the storm. Does that make sense, Curtis?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that one of the issues that we have, and I think it was raised here, is that disaster relief items should be consigned to the government through the national disaster offices, which the standard practice, the standard policy is that these goods are given priority in customs, and also they are not subject to the thorough processes of customs. There are no duties paid, and these goods can be achieved immediately upon landing. I know Mr. Telemac and I, when we were at the Antigua port, that was a policy that was in place. When the goods are landed for the national disaster offices, we just call them and to tell them, just come for the goods. We don't want them here at the port because they're already designated for the impacted population. So that, I think that has to have a relationship with the port and customs. Many times the discussion on relief goods and policies is limited towards the customs discussion, and many times the port does not have a seat at the table, and the port is a critical functionary in this process, this logistics process, and that, I think that there has to be a broader discussion that fully incorporates the Port Authority in manipulating and advising the environment.
So it's a good point, Curtis. And my last comment on this is also that port authorities and emergency authorities need to have a really honest discussion with themselves as to what their capacity is to do this. And the example I can give you, Curtis, is one that you're familiar with. I remember we offered to donate, I think it was 35,000 gallons of fuel into Marsh Harbor right after Dorian. And unfortunately, we'd had it containerized in Miami, kind of ready to go and ready for delivery into Marsh Harbor. And unfortunately, the Achilles heel of that operation that caused it to not go forward was the Bahamian government's ability to store or account for and control dangerous goods like fuel. So it really was a regulatory and capacity issue on the destination end, on the part, unfortunately, on the part of the Bahamian authorities, that prevented us from donating thousands and thousands of gallons of fuel that would have kept emergency vehicles running on behalf of the Bahamian government to begin with. So it's not a knock on them, but I think that really it's worth it to have a very honest look in the mirror, depending on, if the government is to be the consignee of emergency supplies. Does the government on the receiving end actually have the ability to manage and distribute those supplies meaningfully that will actually help and not hurt? I think that's to close that one. Thank you, Curtis. I appreciate your comments. Mona?
Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Rob. I'm just looking at the time here, and I don't mean to interrupt this very fruitful.
No, it's good.
But I just want to be mindful. I know we're all busy, and especially you folks that are joining us today. I know you have busy schedules, so I would just like to close by thanking Brian, Todd, and Rob for joining us today for this wonderful and important and very timely discussion. I think it highlighted beautifully how important it is to really bring all stakeholders together. I think this is a discussion that we can hopefully continue in the future, and hopefully provide an opportunity to share our experiences, to learn from each other on this important matter. Rob, if it's okay with you, can we share your presentation with the attendees?
Yeah, absolutely, please. And one thing that I did not, that I neglected to include on there is our contact information. Happy to send that out as well for Todd, Brian, and myself if you have follow-up questions or would like to engage with us further and see how we can become partners.
Wonderful. We appreciate it. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rob. And most importantly, thank you to our representatives from the port authorities, from CIDIMA and the Port Management Association of the Caribbean. We're grateful that we can continue this fruitful dialogue amongst each other. And if there's anything we've missed, anything that you would like us to address, please let us know. We're always happy to provide those opportunities. And
awesome. Thank you, Mona.
To Kim, our Executive Secretary for Integral Development, I think she also had to join that meeting that Jorge had to leave us for. So big thank you also to her for her support. And you all stay safe, and we'll see each other soon.
Thanks, Mona. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.